In the program, there are some short biographical sketches of our two presenters. I'm not going to read those to you. Let me just supplement them a little bit. Ken Gauss. He's one of the very best researchers on staffing and connecting changes in persons, positions, and organizations to policy shifts and their broader implications. The books he has published, for many of us, provide a very handy and authoritative reference to personnel and organizations and movements. And Ken is on many North Korea watchers' must-call list when they're digging into all but the most macro of topics. So we're really very fortunate to have Ken present on that today. Sue Terry. She's one of the most seasoned and sought-after experts on North Korean developments. Now, I believe that what you see depends upon where you stand. It's a phrase I've used for a long time, and maybe you have to think about it. But Sue has been a student and a teacher, an analyst, and a manager of policy at the highest levels. She's been a business consultant, and now she's a think tanker. So I'm sure each position that she's held has given her a different perspective on the strategic and human rights challenges that North Korea poses. So it's a personal pleasure to have these two on this afternoon's panel on coping strategies and political adaptation. We'll start with Ken.
I'd like to applaud everybody in this room who, especially the students here that are studying Korea. I got in this business back about 30 years ago in looking at North Korea and especially North Korean leadership dynamics. And I used to go to the occasional conferences that we would have and workshops around DC, and it was the same old folks. And even today, we have a lot of the same old folks in the room that are looking at these things. It's time for new blood. It's time for new ideas. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my framework on how I think the economy fits into the larger North Korean security dynamic and the security decision-making, and how that plays out vis-a-vis the relationship with the United States on the nuclear program. It's all tied together. And so I'm going to basically tell you a story today. It's not going to be a typical thing, no slides up here. I'm going to basically tell you a story and walk you through the Kim Jong-un period and tell you why the economy is at the absolute center of Kim's decision-making. In order to understand Kim Jong-un's strategy for his country, one must first understand that it has a logic to it. It is sequential and not based on random decision-making. He's not making it up as he goes along. There is actually a strategy, and it's actually a strategy that goes back into place back toward the last and the ending days of his father's regime. And Kim has been, I think, well kind of inculcated into this strategy. I think the last will and testament from Kim Jong-il, which we're still trying to ratify, there are about 13 different copies out there, but they all seem to agree on some aspects of it. And those aspects are, one, you cannot reunify the peninsula by force. North Korea hasn't been able to do that. Kim Il-sung really kind of admitted to that to Erich Honecker, the head of the East German Communist Party in the 1980s. That's why you saw really the acceleration of the nuclear program in the 90s, because they have to take an asymmetric path toward their own survival. But at the heart of all of this is the economy, because in order to realize the strong and prosperous nation, which is kind of code word for the North Korean economy and where they want to go, they have to link into the South Korean economy. That's the ultimate goal. Even though they're freezing out the South Koreans right now, there is a strategy here, and we'll talk about that. So for all the time that we spend talking about the nuclear program and Pyongyang's covert agenda for peninsula domination. As I said, I think in my opinion, if you want to see Kim's strategy for the future, you need to look at how he treats the economy. This is where he wants to build his legacy. If you go back to his first public speech on the 100th anniversary of his grandfather's birth, April 15, 2012, it was about, that's the so-called belt-tightening speech, or the idea that the North Koreans would no longer have to tighten their belts. It was all about the economy. That is the Rosetta Stone for understanding where Kim wants to go. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean he has all the answers, but Kim also is a very different leader than his father. His father made decisions based on a short timeline and very tactical, from getting point A to point B, point C. He was basically playing out time. Kim Jong-un, on the other hand, is a very young man. He is looking over the horizon. He is thinking very strategically. And unlike his father, he is willing to accept failure and accept a high degree of risk to make this work. So keep all that in mind. What I'm doing is setting up the framework right now for the assumptions that are going to go into how I see North Korea and how it operates, which is very different than I think what most of you hear in the articles and things that you read out there these days. I think that one of the problems that we have as analysts on North Korea is that we approach the topic of Pyongyang and its calculus from the framework from which we're most comfortable. If we are economists, we focused on the economy. If we are security analysts, such as myself, we focus on security issues. We need to take a holistic approach to understanding North Korea. We need to begin, and this is something where I think where most Western policymakers get it wrong. We look at the outside in. What is the best for U.S. policy and the Western international order? I look at it from the opposite. What is in it from Kim's point of view? And work from the outside in, and you get a very different point of view here of how this works. So when we begin by focusing on Kim and work our way out, our analysis should include key individuals and key sources of advice. It should take into account the economic realities of the country, and it should appreciate the national security and foreign policy dilemmas that face the regime. It all begins with the issue of legitimacy. And this, I was interested to listen to Ambassador Lippert's comments today because I think he has a framework in which he looks at it. And my framework and his framework almost match up, but there's some significant differences here. I think the key thing on why Kim can and cannot do things comes back to legitimacy. So keep that in mind. As a third-generation leader of a totalitarian regime, family heredity is not enough to guarantee legitimacy for Kim Jong-un. He has to show competency as a leader and protect the equities of the regime. His overarching goals and regime are, and these are two things, that Kim will not make any decision that violates one of these goals. One is stability of the regime. Two is perpetuation of Kim family rule. Every decision he makes will be in adherence to those two overarching goals. So the question is, how do you secure these goals? Do you focus on the nuclear program as your source of legitimacy? Or do you focus on the economy as your source of legitimacy? Because there's only two ways that Kim is presented in which he can have legitimacy. It's either on the nuclear program or the economy. What Kim Jong-un has decided to do is embrace both, hence Byungjin. He has tied these two together, that the nuclear program will create the environment for the eventual economic development. But what many, especially in the West, tend to forget is that these two parts of Byungjin are not exactly equal. We tend to always focus on the nuclear program. The nuclear program, I would argue, is in service of the eventual goal, which is economic development. Securing a strong and prosperous nation, that is what Kim ultimately wants. Doesn't mean he's given up the nuclear program, but that's his key driving force. If you go back to Kim Jong-un's first public speech, as I said, it was all about the economy and the focus on the economy. Kim's initial moves in the direction of the economic development begin in 2012 with the economic measures. which he lays out that are related to agriculture and industrial development, and dealing with the inevitable military backlash, which came very quickly. Remember, those measures came out in around May and June, and who was purged in June of 2012? The powerful chief of the general staff, Jong-un. Why? Because at a Politburo meeting, he pushed back against the idea of having economic development core center, because that flew in the face of military first policy, which of course was the ruling philosophy of Kim Jong-il. It is not the ruling philosophy of Kim Jong-un. So Kim's initial moves, were made to try to deal with the problems that were presented to the country. These economic measures gave managers the power to set salaries and hire and fire employees, gave farmers a little bit more stake in outproducing quotas. What was clear is that this was a first tentative step away from military first, the so-called military first policy. And as I said, the first casualty of this was the chief of the general staff, Jong-un. When we talk about all the purges that took place in North Korea that we like to point to, with the exception of Chong Son-taek, and that's a special case, and we can talk about that in Q&A if you want. But it was basically to put the military in a box, to basically put them under control so that Kim could actually engage in the policy that he eventually wanted to do. In 2013, Kim begins to put into place the personnel who will be responsible for this economic policy. His father's premier, Cho Young-nim, was replaced by a figure tied to the idea of economic development, and that's Pak Pong-chu. He was elected to the Politburo in March of 2013, and on April 1st, he replaced Cho Young-nim in his second term as premier. Remember, Kim Jong-il had actually gotten rid of Pak Pong-chu around the time of the currency revaluation back in 2009. He has now come back to the center. And with Pak comes a cadre of people that are actually close to Kim Kyung-hui, which is Kim Jong-un's aunt, who is tied into the light industry parts of the economy. And that's critical here because a lot of these people will begin to rise over the next year or so. On April 22nd, 2013, he chaired the first full session of the cabinet, which included the discussion of Byung-jin, as well as budgetary issues for the people's economy in the first and second quarters of 2013. And in July, it was announced that Pak's cabinet would take full authority over economic measures by calling for unconditional execution of the cabinet's decisions and instructions. Now remember, this was during the period of escalation of crisis on the peninsula. You remember back in April, or actually end of March, April, in May, when you had Key Resolve and Full Eagle, you had actually these tensions being ratcheted up rhetorically very high on the peninsula. And everybody was focusing on that. Oh my God, this guy's lost his mind. You had Kim Yong-chol come out and actually abrogate the Armistice Treaty. All of this sort of thing. We were all focused on that. And we were missing what was actually going on behind the scenes, which is the lines of control and authority over the economy were being shifted around. And the military was being put somewhat in a box. And it would play out over the next several months as you see a widespread purging within the military take place. So after the dissolution of the regent structure, which happened at the end of 2013 with the execution and the purging and execution of Chong Son-taek, Kim Jong-un began to draw from his aunt's patronage system, Kim Kyung-hui's patronage system, to build out his circle of advisors, senior advisors, formal advisors, people like Oh Soo-young and An Chung-soo, who hailed from the light industrial sector, began to take prominent roles within the leadership. They joined well-established planners such as Oh Tu-chol, to create a cadre of economic technocrats familiar with international economic practices inside North Korea. These are people that had traveled outside the country and actually had some experience and some interaction with Western economists about the intricacies of economic planning and how economics worked outside of North Korea. Doesn't mean they adopted those strategies, but they were actually informed about them. But according to many defectors and rumors inside North Korea, this is not where the engine of economic thought takes place in North Korea. It's not in the formal. It's within Kim Jong-un's personal secretariat. There is a cadre of very young individuals in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And these people have lived outside of North Korea. They've had access to and experience in the World Bank and the international economic community. They have a very good understanding of how the world works economically. This is where a lot of the thinking behind North Korea's economic policy is coming from. Now, doesn't mean that it's being executed, or even being fully implemented. It can only be implemented in a very step-by-step process, but it is where kind of the intellectual engine. And a lot of these people are also tied into the Danju, the moneyed elite within North Korea, which are, I think, playing an increasingly important role inside North Korea and in terms of Kim Jong-un's thinking. So in 2014, some of this progressive thinking on the economy begins to surface in terms of policy. It is a period that we see the real erosion of military first as the regime's guiding philosophy, replaced by the dominance of the party. And unlike under Kim Il-sung, when you had a shift from the military thinking or military first to party first, this did not come with actually empowering the party over the economy. Actually, it led to the party devolving some authority further down the chain of command for economic measures. Kim Jong-un essentially embraced a different approach to the economy than his grandfather did. One area where this was particularly clear was in the amendments to the Enterprise Act in 2014, which granted state-owned enterprise managers broader rights to engage in foreign trade and joint ventures, as well as the ability to accept investment from domestic private investors, the Danju. And I would agree what was said earlier today. Investing in North Korea is a highly risky venture, and most likely you're going to lose your shirt. But the ideas are beginning to percolate. But the infrastructure is obviously not there yet. But the ideas and the theoretical groundwork is being laid for what I think will come eventually down the line. While the party seems to have maintained some of its overarching responsibility for setting strategy, much of the decision-making authority for the economy was pushed down to the command of the state-owned enterprise directors and provincial leaders who have been invested with responsibility for meeting targets minus party constraints to a certain extent. According to some sources, party provincial leaders have even been ordered to take a hands-off approach. Now, what does this kind of mean? Basically, what Kim is, in his economic brain trust, is experimenting with is the idea of pushing responsibility and accountability down further in the system and hoping that it will generate some positive dynamics for the economy. I would say that it has had some effect, but it has also had some major challenges, as we've talked about earlier today about corruption and other things, which the regime is still trying to work out and is actually endemic to the regime, and it's going to be very difficult to overcome. So you have these ideas, these new ideas running up to against regime factors in a major way these days. This is also a period in which North Korea began a diplomatic charm campaign. After that crisis I talked about in March, April, and May, or March and April, the full legal and key resolve exercises ended on April 30th, 2012, or 2013. And then all of a sudden, you had the diplomatic charm campaign. And basically for almost 3 years, 2013, 2014, 2015, you did not have testing of weapons systems. You had the reaching out from North Korea, first to South Korea and the United States, which basically said strategic patience. So North Korea said, well, can't do that. And so they shifted over to Japan with the abduction issue. Remember in 2014, they had a meeting on the abductions. But then Abe's political fortunes began to go south, and they moved away from that. Then they reached out to the Russians. And remember, in 2015, we were talking about possibly Kim's first foreign trip would be to Moscow. And again, that fell through. And his actual Minister of Defense, who was in charge of putting that together, was executed. So then what happens? Kim then says, okay, why don't we try South Korea again? So then you have, in August, during our big military joint exercise, you had basically the DMZ crisis, where they plant bombs along the DMZ. A few South Korean soldiers are hurt, and that then leads to an escalation. Basically, they escalate to de-escalate. So they escalate the crisis, and then they try to re-engage. But the U.S. says, nah, strategic patience. And North Korea says, okay. Kim says, okay, I've got the 7th Party Congress coming up in 2016 in May. I haven't got anything to show for my legitimacy. I got to go hell for leather on national security because this economy thing isn't working, this diplomacy thing isn't working. And so what do you see in January? Well, in December, Kim Jong-un, who is in charge of the diplomatic strategy, has an unfortunate accident, in his car, and he's killed. So he's out of the way. Kim Yong-chol is put in the head of ROC Affairs. And in January, you have the 5th nuclear test, followed by missiles and all the other things. And that was basically to, okay, if I can't make my legitimacy on the economy and diplomacy, I am going to make it as a national security leader. And so that's what he did, and that's what happened really over the last couple of years. But he wanted to really kind of keep, one thing that really kind of showed us how invested he was in that diplomatic campaign in the 2013 to 2015 timeframe was a very interesting thing, was the fact that you had during that time frame, you had The Interview, the movie. Remember The Interview that we were all, excited about? There have only been 2 movies made in the history of Hollywood where the leader, a sitting leader, has been actually killed on screen. One, and they're both North Korea, Team America with the puppets, and number 2 was The Interview. But North Korea, instead of lashing out with provocations with the Interview, basically used a cyber attack on Sony as a way of basically keeping the diplomatic strategy on track without interrupting that. But by 2016, they had basically Kim had run out of cards to play, so he had to go back to the testing. And so that continues, really, and, he has the 7th Party Congress, which basically lays the foundation for his legitimacy as the leader as we've moved from the Kim Jong-il period to the Kim Jong-un period. And at that same period, he also had the 5-year economic plan, which is the first time they really had an economic plan since the 1980s. And he lays out in very thin detail, what this thing is going to be. But it is a way of focusing the mind on the military, on the economy, even though they are doing what they're doing in terms of missile testing and nuclear tests that were taking place in that time frame. And by asserting that economic development is essential for the country's strength, Kim's wording in this discussion that he had at the 7th Party Congress went far beyond his often pledge to improve the livelihoods of the people. And basically what he was doing is establishing a new formulation for the economy's relationship to regime stability and national defense. His remarks suggested Kim's break with his father's military first politics. In the opinion of the current government, according to one Pyongyang watcher, it was growing harder to sustain guns without butter. Kim's language tacitly recognized that as sanctions increasingly targeted economic resources that directly supported North Korea's armed forces, the military could no longer operate a viable parallel economic system. Remember, we talked about earlier today, if you look at the way the North Korean economy is organized, you have the royal economy, you have the military economy, the cabinet economy. Basically, by this time, the military economy and the cabinet economy are somewhat being blended. And the way that we know this is that at the end of this process, you have the appointments. And what happens in those appointments? Pak Pong-chu is appointed to the Central Military Commission and the National Defense Commission, the two key national security bodies. The first time a economic technocrat had been put in these bodies. That is to give an economic voice to the national security strategy of the country. It is no longer a bunch of military folks and party folks calling the shots. You now have the military, the cabinet has a voice at the table. So let me kind of move through here. So anyway, you have the 2017, the period of Little Rocket Man and Dotard and the rising escalation on the, and then this is where I would disagree with Ambassador Limpert today about why North Korea came to the table, which really kind of tells you about the resiliency of the economy, because he made kind of the idea that while it was resilient, they may not be able to carry, they may have to actually make some tough decisions going forward. And then the idea is, well, there was all this pressure in 2016, 2017 that led to North Korea coming to the negotiating table, or at least that would seem to be the implication. I would say, no, that's not what led North Korea to come to the table. North Korea came to the table because three things happened in 2017. And I would argue that if these things had not happened, they would not have come to the table in 2018. One, you had an unconventional president being elected in the United States that says, yeah, I'll sit down with Kim. That's unprecedented. Really to actually talk about the idea of meeting with Kim Jong-un. That's something that the North Korean leadership has really valued and really lusted after for decades. So that's one. Number two, what happens in South Korea? The conservative administration out, progressive administration in, that wants to engage with North Korea. And number three is basically he got his nuclear program by the end of 2017 to a point where he could take a strategic pause and declare, okay, we're going to shift back to diplomacy. We have now got everything in place that we want, and we expect to have benefits coming out of this going into diplomacy with a groundwork that is much more favorable to North Korea's calculus. Well, he has the meeting in Singapore, or actually he has the meetings with South Korea. Well, let's back up just a little bit. The first thing, again, the issue of China. What happened at the very beginning of all this in 2018, Basically, President Trump says, yes, I will meet with Kim. Let's set it up. The alarm bells in China went off. Oh my God, this actually could be serious. We need to get Kim over here now. And so that's what led to that. It was being basically driven by Beijing out of an absolute panic, because Ambassador Lippert's absolutely right. China wants North Korea leaning toward China. If the United States if North Korea begins to cozy up with North Korea, that is not what China wants, because that is not what is in China's larger interest here. So that happens. Then you have the meetings with President Moon and Kim. And Kim makes very clear what is his driving agenda here: sanctions relief. I want Mount Kumgang, I want Kaesong Industrial Complex as being examples of what he could take from the South Koreans. And so the engagements begin, and then the United States engagement begins with North Korea. And you have Singapore. And of course they agree, yes, we're going to try to improve relations, but then they can't agree on what does denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula mean. To the United States, it means unilateral denuclearization of North Korea. To North Korea, it means something very different that goes back to the 1950s when they really codified their nuclear doctrine. And it is something that is much broader than that, and it involves also denuclearization of the other side, which would mean the elimination of the nuclear umbrella over Korea and Japan, as well as some other things. So North Korea has no intention of unilaterally denuclearizing. So that falls through. But then you have things that kind of, get back on pace, especially after Special Representative Began's speech at Stanford, which does suggest maybe a phased reciprocal process in the works. And so North Korea gets excited again, comes to Hanoi thinking they've got something worked out. They put their cards on the table, and President Trump pushes back. Pushes back against that in the idea of a grand bargain, basically the Libya model. North Korea is never going to go for that. So that's kind of where where we are right now is not surprising. The U.S. has not put anything on the table in terms of sanctions relief, and the North Koreans are basically playing coy about coming back to the working level meetings, which Secretary Pompeo just a couple of days ago said, we're not going to have these meetings at the end of September like we thought, because the new method that President Trump had touted after the dismissal of National Security Advisor Bolton, in which the North Koreans, I think, thought this was going to tie into to sanctions relief. President Trump at the UN made it very clear that that's not the case. So, if you want to talk about, where we're going to go from here and what the U.S. strategy should be and what works and what may not work, we can talk about that in Q&A. Thank you.
Fascinating. I have 10,000 questions for Ken. This is going to be a good, interesting discussion. I think he's absolutely right. We often look at North Korea issue with our Western lens, rather than trying to get it from their perspective. And I'll have to tell you, every Korea watcher bring their own bias, 100%. And I bring my own bias of looking at this issue from security lens. I bring my own bias of having looked at North Korean issue from intelligence perspective, having worked from CIA from 2001, US-centric perspective. But I will tell you, every other Korea watcher have their own bias too. So we just this is why this kind of discussion is helpful, to just kind of think things through, right? Nobody has a one answer. So let me just pick up from where he left off, just starting from Hanoi. Because in Hanoi, what basically happened, I think, is that two leaders fundamentally misjudged each other, right? So Kim may have calculated that, listening to pundits like myself, President Trump he's so desperate for some sort of foreign policy success that he's going to go in there and make a bad deal. That was kind of this, what was being talked about here, right? There was concern about that. So that Kim might have thought, here President Trump is going to reward him with maximal sanctions relief in exchange for basically continued moratorium on nuclear missile testing, the long-range kind, obviously, limited, or putting limits on existing nuclear stockpiles, and a possible Yongbyon shutdown. And I think President Trump, absolutely, I think Ken is right, that thinking that Kim was brought to the negotiating table primarily because of maximum pressure, policy and fire and fury rhetoric and Rocky Man on a suicide mission and all of that, rather than North Korea's own advance in its nuclear missile program. Also thought he could just entice Kim with this Vietnam-style economic development, just make Kim give up nuclear weapons. So obviously neither expectation was borne out in Hanoi, as we saw. But what was really interesting to me is that it was kind of made clear from Hanoi that what Kim really wanted more than anything else was sanctions relief, right? I think because the Trump administration was ready to offer a couple of things. The peace declaration was absolutely on the table. There was even discussion about it, and that was potentially on the table. Opening up a liaison office was also on the table. But what Kim demanded was sanctions relief, right? So clearly that was his priority, and that continues to be Kim's priority since Hanoi. So then that brings us to the question of where are we with the sanctions? So I just wanted to sort of start there from the impact of sanctions, what is the impact of sanctions on North Korea, and then I'll discuss North Korea's evasion efforts to get around that, and its overall, just a little brief commentary on its overall strategy going forward. So just brief background on the sanctions. Ambassador Lipper alluded to the 2015, 2016, 2017 period. And I do think 2016, 2017, leading up to 2017, was a turning point in terms of sanctions regime. Everybody knows after fourth nuclear test on January 2016, Park Geun-hye administration closed the Kaesong industrial complex, and then the United States followed that with a passage of North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, which was a new law basically dramatically expanding the scope of sanctions against North Korea. And of course, then UNSC followed with adoption of Resolution 2270, which really marked the turning point in the North Korea sanctions regime by targeting North Korea's non-military exports in a bid to really deny hard currency to the Kim Jong-un regime. And of course, the subsequent resolutions adopted from November 16 to December 2017, then incrementally transformed the threat of broad sectoral sanctions, prohibiting roughly 90% of North Korean commercial exports, and requiring repatriation of North Korean laborers, overseas workers, by the end of 2019. These resolutions, I do think, curtailed financial and shipping activities related to North Korea, capped the crude oil and fuel exports to North Korea, and banned exports of all industrial machinery, transportation vehicles, and metals to North Korea. And then, really, as surprising many Korea watchers, including skeptical Korea watchers like myself, we actually saw China enforcing sanctions. And I really thought at the time, it's like, oh no, when you're used to just following China for a long time, you say, no, China is not going to actually implement sanctions. But we actually saw China implement sanctions. And the US secondary sanctions adopted after the passage of North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act also put some teeth behind them, because it mandated US executive branch to sanction North Korean entities involved in WMD-related activities, as well as their enablers in third countries. And the law provides discretionary authority to sanction third country entities for violating UN sectoral sanctions in goods such as coal and fuel, and includes provisions for violating North Korean human rights. It also bans the entry of goods made by North Korean overseas workers from entering the United States. The US has also designated North Korea as a jurisdiction of primary money laundering concern, requiring banks to undertake due diligence to prevent direct or indirect North Korean access to US financial system and therefore US dollars. However, the US did not apply secondary sanctions to major Chinese banks, as some sanctions advocates call for. Those who say we have to do that, perhaps judging that the risk of setting off a financial crisis was not worth it with China. But regardless, as a result, I think in 2017 we did see fire and fury. In the midst of fire and fury and maximum pressure and rocket men on a suicide mission, all of that, I do think we did see more of Beijing enforcing sanctions than ever before, really starting about mid-2017. And we saw that, yes, enforcement of UN sanctions and Chinese embargo on fuel exports did have an impact. I mean, I don't think we can say they did not have an impact. The North Korea's exports went down by some 88% in 2018. Most of North Korea's exports of $200 million worth of coal, iron ore, seafood, textiles with its ally China dwindled. There's no question about that. We saw North Korean petrol and gas prices hike up, as well as prices of food. I don't know if you guys go to see, Peter Ward just had an article out talking about that, talking about what sanctions enforcement looked like in this particular time period, and fuel prices spiked up between 150 to 250% prior to the prior level in mid to late 2017. Rice prices also went up more than 20 percentage points. Corn prices rose up more than 60 percentage points. But more importantly, I think sanctions banning North Korea's most lucrative exports deprived the Kim regime the main source of income, and therefore we saw that those people who are living off the state, like party officials and soldiers and police officers, and these guys, some 20 to 30% of these people, people that were on government's payroll were feeling the effects of sanctions. So I don't think we can say, well, it did have impact on particularly these people, more sharply than even ordinary people, because as we talked about earlier, ordinary people can have learned to fend themselves by relying on private markets. That said, sanctions were, and we talked about this earlier, still very far from leading to an acute economic crisis in North Korea. It have not led to the point where North Korea's economy is at a breaking point. Ambassador Lippert talked about resiliency of the economy. It did not lead to the point where Kim cannot hang on anymore, or played any kind of pivotal role in terms of Kim taking substantial steps towards denuclearization for sanctions relief. So today it appears that exchange rates, food prices, prices of rice, prices of corn, and fuel still relatively stable. Won seems to be holding steady against the dollar, even if the foreign currency reserve is dwindling or depleting. North Korea obviously continues to defy the international community by continually building and working on the nuclear missile program. I think reports continually show that they have not stopped these activities. They are still test missiles, although now it's a short-range variety. And after more than 2+ years of maximum pressure and engagement policy, North Korea appeared to even retain this veneer of prosperity, and construction continues of some of these showpiece projects, and exports, while they have dropped, I think the imports are continuing. So we have to then ask, why is this the case? And this is because despite the sanctions regime, Kim is able to also evade sanctions, right? Mark Lippert talked about networks, the informal networks, but really with a combination of sanctions evasion techniques or measures, such as engaging in illicit ship-to-ship transfers of petroleum, coal, and other products, continued illicit activities of cybercrime, let's talk about that. And then, of course, the abuse of financial system by the North Korean diplomats and overseas work representatives of North Korean banks. Because of these measures, North Korea is able to circumvent sanctions. In fact, North Korea massively increased the use of ship-to-ship transfers, I think with more than some 50 vessels and with some 160 companies currently under investigation by the United Nations North Korea panel of experts. And on ship-to-ship transfers, we can just talk a little bit about these evasion techniques. On ship-to-ship transfers, the vessels operating on North Korea's behalf transmit this automatic identification systems or other vessels. I mean, Bill knows more about this than anybody else, effectively stealing other vessels' identities to remain undetected. And there are other methods such as switching off AIS signal entirely, providing false documentation, or changing the physical appearance of the ships. Financial institutions end up unwittingly facilitating transactions associated with these illegal ship-to-ship transfers. So there's one problem. And then there's obviously a cybersecurity, growing number and sophistication of these cyber attacks by North Korea on financial institutions. North Korea's intelligence agency, Reconnaissance General Bureau, leads and coordinates these cyber attacks to steal funds from financial institutions and cryptocurrency exchange to generate income. This works for the Kim regime because in cyberspace, the RGB, the Reconnaissance General Bureau, does not have to go through all these hoops, jump through all these hoops to arrange these complex evasion schemes to access the banking system through front companies. Or your false documents or any of that. Instead, they can just rely on just laptop and basically internet access to commit these crimes. And then this allows the Kim regime to evade financial sanctions effectively by engaging in theft. And all of you guys know about the Bangladesh bank episode in February 2016, but even since then, there's as many incidences and examples of how North Koreans were able to use cyber attacks to really generate money. And not only does North Korea just target financial sanctions, but cryptocurrency exchanges as well. But I will just leave it at that since we don't have too much time. Let me just continue. But I think that is one major way that North Korea is being able to evade sanctions. And then finally, also, North Korea also continues to use diplomatic cover to engage in illicit activities. Financial institutions obviously fall prey to North Korean diplomats who establish bank accounts in their own names of their own family members, front companies, and then they use these transactions to conduct, illicit transactions in violation of sanctions. There are also many examples of that. North Korean institutions just continue to install also their operatives very successfully abroad. Again, UN North Korea panel of experts are investigating more than multiple dozens of such cases. They have an excellent report out that I think came out early September this month, August. If you can look it up, they have many examples of this, how this works. And basically, this kind of scheme allows North Korean companies to buy and sell goods overseas without much trace in the formal financial system. So North Korea works tirelessly to minimize impact of sanctions is the point. So let me just now spend a few minutes just talking about what North Korea's larger strategy is. I think in the very short term, working level negotiations are very much possible. I think it might finally happen between Washington and Pyongyang. And I think it's also very much possible that that could lead to a interim deal, some sort of interim deal that brings North Korea some sort of sanctions relief in US dollars, which is what, again, North Koreans are looking for and they are seeking. The question to me is whether these negotiations, which are expected to resume, can produce an agreement or arrangement that really advances towards this amorphous goal of denuclearization that was laid out in Singapore. I think coming up with a roadmap to advance the Singapore Declaration with a timetable for disarmament and a declaration of North Korea's existing stockpile. To me, these are the concrete steps towards denuclearization. I think that will remain highly unlikely. I think it will be a very substantial challenge to get the North Koreans to give us that. I think the only way to really reduce the North Korean nuclear threat is to get IAEA inspectors in there to oversee the suspension of nuclear operations and the seal off and install monitoring cameras. But there's absolutely no indication that we're going to be headed in that direction or such agreement is foreseeable. Possible in foreseeable future. But while there is still remains a possibility of I still think some sort of deal is possible. That is because we saw in Hanoi that North Korea was willing to put up on the negotiating table. They were willing to put up Yongbyon plus some. I think it really depends on the Trump administration. Ultimately, as we saw, I started out in this discussion in the beginning, we saw in Hanoi, they want sanctions relief. Is the Trump administration willing to give to that? And I think that is the debate. I think in reality, what we are looking at is an arms control negotiation, and we can debate whether that's a good thing or not a good thing, but I guess that is the point of debate. And now, the momentum is there for some sort of talks. We just, Ambassador Bolton has been fired. We're the most hawkish of the Trump administration officials. Began has been promoted. I think North Koreans like that. I think they were ready to come back to the talks. But again, there's just a lot of also moving pieces. Like somebody asked earlier today about the impeachment, what's going on in domestic policy, how much is this going to be a distraction for President Trump or not? But absent provocations from North Korea in the form of new nuclear tests or long-range missile tests, and we know that President Trump has dismissed these short-range missile tests as, every country does it. He didn't make a big deal of it. I think we're moving towards some sort of a deal. I do think it's going to be very hard for Kim to, well, not only Kim, but I think it's very hard. I think from Kim's perspective, in terms of U.S. policy, I think it's very hard for us to return to maximum pressure, given that this time, the second time around, the whole Fire and Fury thing is not as credible. Also, it's given that both Seoul and Beijing, Moscow, or almost everybody have essentially moved on in terms of where we were in 2017, when we did have more of an international consensus. So final analysis, I would just say the negotiation process has taken us off the crisis path that we were on, that's a good news. But I don't think necessarily that we're any safer. And bottom line analysis from my perspective, I think I don't know, this is where we might slightly disagree. I believe that Kim's ultimate goal is to get an international acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. Maybe that's the base in which he can truly then economically develop, but that's what Kim needs. And the way we are headed, I would say that Kim is closer to achieving that goal. He has to just hang on a little longer than we are achieving our goal, if denuclearization still is our goal, and we can debate, we can talk about that.
Thank you both very, very much. Really interesting presentations. I'll open the floor to questions. And we have somebody walking with the mic. Great. Please, we'll start here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and our former diplomat. Are we so heartless that we would go forward with a deal that doesn't touch the human rights atrocity? And can any of you suggest any step at all that could move that issue even a little bit? Or could it be a deal breaker in a negotiation about nuclear matters?
Let's collect a couple more questions, and then we'll, in the middle.
Hi, thanks. Mike Billington. In terms of the question of whether they want to be a nuclear power or whether there's some other approach, I mean, my sense was that the closest thing to international cooperation that they had with the Rason port, where Russia and South Korea were working together in the north, that's pretty much off the table, as I understand it. But in terms of what would make North Korea believe they had security, I think would not just be a promise from the United States, but since you have Trump committed to maintaining a friendly relationship with Russia and with Putin, that if you have an agreement between the US and North Korea, which includes Russia and of course also China, would that be adequate for Kim Jong-un to believe that he could trust to give up his nuclear program?
As far as human rights, I guess I'm heartless. You put human rights on the table, you're not getting anything. I think human rights in North Korea get solved organically as North Korea develops. It is not going to be solved by us holding it out there as a matter of principle. But again, maybe you can weave it in there as long as you have enough carrots to get Kim to somewhat at least make some sort of statement, positive statement on it. But you know, I've always been dubious about the idea of leading with human rights to solve this problem. I think it is something that has to happen organically in the process of North Korea joining the community of the international community. Although I think that is a long time off. As far as the what we could do to get them to embrace security. Look, U.S. does not have a lot of credibility when it comes to making promises on security to totalitarian regimes. I mean, all you have to do is look at the Libya situation. All you have to do is look at the JCPOA with Iran. Anything the U.S. says on security, and this is why I don't think North Korea really cares all that much about security guarantees, because they're empty promises as far as they're concerned. They want something tangible. Over time, building up trust, I think, is probably the way that you have to approach it. If you want to have progress on the North Korea account, you have to look at it from Kim's point of view. And you got to figure out what is it that Kim wants that you can give him that will allow him to then divest himself at least of some part of the nuclear program, not all of it. And this is what I think the most you can get right now. You put sanctions, significant sanctions relief on the table. And then you might get Yongbyon Plus, which means plus probably part of the uranium reprocessing capability. Why do I say that? Is because when you look at the way the nuclear program is structured in North Korea, it has three masters. It has a civilian master, it has a party master, and it has a military master. There is room for negotiation on the nuclear program, as opposed to the missile program, which is wholly controlled by the military. Very difficult to get access to that. So I would think probably Yongbyon plus something. The idea here is not complete and verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of the North Korea. That won't happen. What you're trying to do is, okay, North Korea can have their nuclear program in a box. Not a fully matured nuclear program, one that has not figured out how to do miniaturization, one that has not learned how to do reentry capability. You keep it in a box. Then you begin to build up the legitimacy of Kim Jong-un on an economic side of the equation of Byung-jin. When you get it to a certain level, then you can begin to ask what you really want. And I call this the Trojan horse strategy. Basically, if you're trying to get North Korea to do something, you give them something they want up front so that you have something to take away. That gives you a bit of leverage, which we do not have right now. And so that's why I think you have to build up his legitimacy. That's why the grand bargain will not work. Because you're basically asking him to give up the nuclear program, his sole source of legitimacy, with some promise maybe in the future you'll get the economic goodies that go along with it. But as I said, the U.S. has no level of trust with North Korea that they would actually follow through. So you've got to do a phased reciprocal process of give and take. And then you basically ask for bits and pieces of the nuclear program. You're not going to get full verification. You're not going to get irreversibility because they don't trust that the next president comes in there going to slap the sanctions right back on. So you can get some dismantling, kind of like what we did with Yongbyon in the mid-2000s, but we're not going to get complete dismantlement of the nuclear program.
But what do you think of the U.S.-Russia acting together in this process?
Here is where it gets interesting. It's what are you willing to live with? The problem we have with North Korea is that we see the solution of North Korea as a zero-sum game, black and white game on the Korean Peninsula. We win, you lose. We need to look at it as a larger regional strategy aimed at containing the rise of China. North Korea acts as a wedge issue. If we are able to woo North Korea by allowing them to have some sort of nuclear program in a box and some economic aid, North Korea would much rather lean west then lean east. And therefore, that gives us the chance to start driving the wedge between North Korea and Beijing, and possibly even Moscow. So I would prefer to keep them out of it in the beginning, but, you know, it really depends on how, you know, how we want to play our cards, because I'm looking at the longer issue. As long as we continue with maximum pressure, one thing that I will predict, the alliance structure will begin to deteriorate. We already see it between Seoul and Tokyo. We already start to see it between the United States and South Korea. I think we have got to try a fundamentally new strategy. Otherwise, our days are numbered.
So I disagree on the human rights issue. Not that you have to go in there and say you have to demand all of these things at once, but I do think it's very important to stay on message on human rights. I'm concerned that we, the Trump administration and other administrations too, use it when it's convenient and then take it away. Look at when the the Trump administration came in. Remember when he had a State of the Union address and had the whole Otto Warmbier's family with him, and came there, and we had that defector with the, you know, at the State of the Union address, and then President Trump went to Seoul and gave this speech on human rights, and then all of that was just gone. Now that Kim Jong-un is a great guy, he's totally in love with him, and everything has just flipped. So it's not a consistent message. But I do think Kim sees it as a pressure point. He actually does. So when the Commission of Inquiry came out with their 400-page report 4 years ago, and it was a great lengthy report. Actually, North Koreans, we were surprised how seriously North Koreans took it. They really wanted to explain, they felt pressure, and I think it does matter. We cannot just give up on it and say it's too difficult issue to solve. It's not to like sort of demand it, but that conversation has to be up there. It has to be up there and not just be completely forgotten about. And second point, on the security, no, I don't think they will make Kim give up nuclear weapons. I think the reality is we need to have a very clear-eyed policy perspective. I think that train has sailed. It's not a sail, right? The ship has sailed. North Korea is a nuclear weapons power. I don't think they are giving it up. We are talking about, in essence, some sort of arms control conversation, and that's, so you can debate what Ken's proposing, whether that's that's what we should do or not. I bet there's a lot of people who disagree with him, but that is a point of debate. You say give and take. So from my perspective, I think we have tried that though. I feel like we have tried give and take. We've been working on this since 1990s, right? Early 1990s, from the Clinton years, the Bush 2 terms, and Obama 2 terms, and now the Trump administration. So it's not like we can sort of debate. U.S. was at fault, the North Koreans cannot trust it. And of course, I agree with that completely. There's Iraq, there's Libya, there's Iran deal now. Why would they ever trust us? And there's a trust deficit. But I also think it's just, giving them just majority of sanctions relief, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that, because what are we going to get for that? That is the only real leverage we have. I know, Ken, you think maybe, what is another leverage that we have? We already have fire and fury. That's out the door. Maximum pressure is also, again, I think it's going to be very hard for us to return to maximum pressure. The environment is now different from 2017. Because of all the hyperactive symmetry and diplomacy, now Kim has normalized himself. He looks like a normal person, normal leader of a normal country. We completely forget about Chang Sung-taek, Kim Jong-nam, or Purges, or anybody else. He's taking a selfie in Singapore, right? He has now met with President Xi Jinping 4 times. President Trump 3 times. Moon Jae-in how many times? It's really hard to get back to that. So what leverage do we have? It's imperfect, but we now have sanctions as leverage. So I think we need to talk very carefully about exactly how much and what point is the right thing. But just giving away sanctions relief and hoping they will lead to some sort of a result, I think also is kind of a dangerous strategy.
We have a question over here.
Hello, my name is Lily. I'm a second-year grad student at Elliott School. So if North Korea were to be acknowledged as an official nuclear state, then do you think maybe we could see treaties similar to INF's treaty or JCPOA?
We didn't hear the end of that.
Oh, sorry. So I'll just repeat a quick question. So if North Korea were to be recognized as an official nuclear state, then do you think we might be able to see some kind of treaty similar to INF Treaty or JCPOA?
I'm not sure, first of all, okay, so before I answer that, I'm not sure if the US is going to go there as in, hey, North Korea and international community, we now accept you as a nuclear weapon state. That's a totally different policy thing. Even what we're talking about, there is a sort of, de facto sort of wink, wink, we get, this is what we're talking about, but we're not going to, I don't see the US administration, not this administration or even the next administration sort of saying, now we're going to accept it as a policy matter here, so that's one thing. Yeah, I do think some sort of agreement with JCPOA, some sort of that kind of agreement is possible. We have to remember we had agreements with North Korea. We had a bilateral agreement with North Korea, 1994 Agree Framework. We had multilateral agreements, six-party talks, or 2005, 2007. We have agreements. I don't think getting to an agreement with North Korea is a problem. We have proved in the past that we can get to some sort of agreement with North Korea. It's just that every time it fell apart over verification. So it's a different side of challenge. It's not getting to an agreement that's a problem. So right now, I think it's possible. We can have another interim agreement. Now, is that the agreement that's going to lead to denuclearization? I'm highly skeptical.
Yeah, I don't think, I think it would be it would be a major challenge to get to a JCPOA with North Korea. That's why I say, basically keep them in a box. And keeping them in a box means three things: no testing, no proliferation, no provocations. As long as you have the no testing, yes, they can do stuff underground in their laboratories and stuff. But if they're not able to test at any level, including short-range missiles, their ability to have any confidence in this program is really nil. So you keep it in a box. The sanctions relief that I talked about, again, I'm not saying about giving them, one, I do not believe in doing a sunshine policy, bags of cash for nothing. This is going to have to be reciprocal. We do something, they do something, we do something, but you're not getting verification and you're not getting irreversibility because that goes at the baseline of their security because they're going to want to reconstitute it. In other words, you've got to assume that North Korea, either now or sometime in the future, will cheat because they don't want to give it up. But the question is, can you keep it in a box, and can you then engage the regime on other things that you may want over time and actually have them see their future somewhat linked with the outside world as opposed to complete juche, which is, really is not good for their decision making.
We had another question over here. Yes.
I'm Kevin, first year student from Adaptation School. I'm gonna ask a question to Mr. King. My question is that what instrument can the U.S. and international society do to give the North Korea the external legitimacy? Because the kind of the totalitarian regime, they do not fear that they have no internal legitimacy. They are police state. They can control the people. So the problem is focused on how to provide the external legitimacy to the North Korea, to North Korea. So what do you think can the international society and the U.S. do to achieve this goal?
That's a good question. It's something we'd have to think through. I mean, we tend to think about legitimacy as being an internal issue, but it does have an external component to it. My view of how to deal with North Korea is not something that takes place over years. It takes place over decades. You're not going to solve the problem of North Korea because the Kim family and the Kim family dynamics are so entrenched in that police state you talk about that making the external legitimacy something we can just convey. What we have to do is we hope through engagement, if we can get North Korea somewhat to act as a normal state in terms of engaging the outside world as opposed to threatening the outside world or feeling threatened by the outside world, that hopefully we could unleash some dynamics inside the regime that over time, and again, decades here, leads to a country that is positioned and is economically developed to a point that you could seriously contemplate reunification on the peninsula in a peaceful manner. But that's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen 10 years from now. It's going to take a long time. But if you basically believe, this is a disgusting regime that violates human rights, which I agree with. But if you believe that taking away the Kim family is going to solve the problem, I would say think very careful. It's better to have the devil you do know versus the devil you don't know. Because there are dynamics inside North Korea that could be unleashed if Kim were to die tomorrow and there is not a legitimate successor in place, and there is not really a good continuance of governance program in place in North Korea, you could have a real catastrophe on the Korean Peninsula. So you're going to have to work with the Kim family for the foreseeable future, but hopefully you can evolve it into something that would have legitimacy to it. But, we deal with other countries that have kind of dodgy, foreign policy and human rights things, and yet we deal with them some of them are our allies. We may have to think about it that way. This is a long-term process.
Well, that brings us to the end of this session. I'd like to say that I really welcome the Q&A part of this because it brought attention to something that we had not talked about earlier today or in any of the presentations, and that's proliferation. We had focused on missiles and the nuclear program, but we hadn't focused on proliferation. And North Korea is not a potential proliferator, it is a known proliferator. It has done it. It's participated in perhaps the most egregious proliferation case that's taken place to date, and that was the provision of the nuclear reactor to Syria. And of course, before it was engaged in nuclear cooperation with Libya. I mean, those are proven facts. So I'm really glad that we added this proliferation control to the box. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Sue. Please.